The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
The essays, the memoirs that document a life or an episode of life, that's actually a portal to a kind of universality. By actually attending to your unique and individual experience, that all of these connections are made with other people who haven't lived that experience. And so I think the best memoir does that. It's not an exercise in staring at ourselves in the mirror. It's actually a way of saying, here's my human experience. Pay attention to me paying attention, and then write your own. It can actually be a selfless kind of act.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Drew Bratcher is a journalist and an essayist whose work has appeared in Oxford American, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Paris Review, Nowhere Magazine, Garden & Gun, and Image Journal. His debut book is Bub, Essays from North of Nashville. It combines memoir and arts criticism, particularly country music criticism. In this episode, Drew Bratcher and I talk about oral storytelling, jam sessions, and MFA programs, among other topics. Well, Drew Bratcher, I'm so glad to have you on the Habit Podcast today. Thanks for making time for me.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So I love your new book, Bub, named for your grandfather.
That's right.
Who you called Bub. And so let's talk about when your grandfather was a raconteur. He hung out with raconteurs and storytellers. And I'd love to let's start there, right? I mean, there's something very raconteurish about your writing style. Having grown up around storytellers, and let's just talk about how the tradition of oral storytelling has shaped the way you write.
It's a great question. My family are great storytellers. And I had the great privilege, which sometimes seemed like an annoyance at the time, to hear a lot of them talking growing up. Around, all they needed was a table and a day between when they'd seen each other last. And there was new material, shape into the air. And so in the year 2022, when we are so incredibly, it's cliche to say it, and yet it's true, distracted, having a hard time determining what's real, what's not real, I treasure that sort of heritage more and more, because what it taught, one of the things that it taught me in retrospect is that life is there for people to make entertainment with, right? To find meaning in.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated the way that they were entertained by life. That TV and movies, that was an aspect. Country radio is always playing, but the main sort of feast was, tell me about what happened today.
Yeah.
And and I was always scared in those settings to speak up for myself. I wouldn't have dared, interjected my own kind of story. I didn't know how to do that. And I felt like my material was nothing compared to, in my grandfather's case, working for the railroad or escaping the coal mines, or in my uncle's case, driving across the country to get a car, all these kinds of things. And I think that writing for me was it was me in a more private space, trying to work with that example that they had set.
Huh. So you weren't invited into the storytelling. You were a recipient of the stories.
For sure. I mean, and sometimes it would happen offhand, you're just walking around with your granddad while he's doing his chores. And this leads to that association. And the next thing, he's telling you a story that you cannot believe you never knew before,
Yeah.
As in the case of what happened to his ear, which is an anecdote I share in the Long Bub essay. But yeah, when I was about 10 years old, as I remember it, we would always spend the night at my grandparents' house just north of Nashville on Friday nights. And after dinner, the kids would usually be sent off to bed, but the grownups would stay up, and they'd stay up late telling stories, talking, and they'd have friends come over. It was a wonderful thing. And we were all envious and anxious to get the chance to stick around. And I was the oldest grandkid, and there came a night where my grandmother said, "Why don't you stay up after dinner? I've made a pie, and you can just be with us." And that was one of the highlights of my life, getting to sit there in that rocking chair in the corner of the porch, listening in, not understanding what I was hearing, but absolutely enamored of this sort of telling room that had been created on that back porch. Now, one of the things I think that distinguishes that the storytelling that they loved and lived and was an aspect of their lives from writing is that they were not interested in their stories with really interpreting them.
Right.
It was really a shaping experience in a kind of entertaining way, to get a rise often, or to make it kind of, to highlight a kind of poignant moment. But there was never any commentary about, okay, so tell me what that means. What's the theme of that? And I think as a listener more than a teller, I was always wanting to know, explain that to me, tell me why. What does it mean? And that's what I find about writing that I love so much, is that you can do both. You can both shape the experience, relay the experience, narrate the experience, but also wonder about what it means.
Yeah, that's good. Of your grandfather, Bub, you write this. If you don't mind me reading it back to you, it was as if the world presented itself principally as material for speech. No experience was complete until it had been said out loud, then said again. I love that idea that of a man going through life, seeing his experience as the raw material for a story, always thinking, maybe, how does this turn into a story? Which, I grew up among storytellers too. And as things happened to me, I can remember thinking, how do I sort of shape this into how's this going to be a story tonight at supper? So I'd love to hear, again, hear you talk about that a little bit, this idea of what you learned from a man for whom the world presented itself principally as material for a story.
Yeah. I think in one way or another, this is what human beings are up to in any number of ways. We are shaping reality. We are, trying to bring some kind of order, maybe for our own sanity, out of the chaos of life. Engineers do it one way, right? Musicians do it another way. Largely uneducated people who are amazing storytellers do it in their own way. And there's a comparable genius right across those different fields and sort of conceptions of reality. Now, what was important, I think, in what you just read back, as I hear it now, strange experience to hear your own writing read back to you.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Is that then tell it again, because he never told it quite the same way twice. And what this suggested to me later on, and even as I was thinking about him when I wrote that piece, which I should say I wrote a year after he passed, which was during COVID, not of COVID, but because of COVID, his funeral was just so unsatisfying. Very few people would come. And so I had this sense like, I just have so much more to say, and I want to get it down before he passes sort of fully into memory. So there's like a desperation, I think, in that essay and in the description, because I'm trying to get a likeness on the page. But there was a sense in which when he told a story, he wasn't exhausting the material. He was coming at it. He was kind of making an attempt, coming at it from a particular direction. And then he'd tell it a different way the next time. And then the stories would just pass out of the repertoire, being replaced by new ones, you know?
Yeah.
And again, like a difference between that and writing, I had this sense, I wonder if you do too, that as long as the story is sort of an oral artifact, as long as it's alive on the tongue, it's still shapeable. There's still mystery to it. You haven't exhausted the possibilities, but when you write it down, it's you sort of set it in stone. Yeah. And so I felt, just to be honest, like I felt some sadness writing some of the essays in this book, because I felt like, okay, I'm sort of done with those stories. You know, they're not that I won't tell them again, maybe get the chance to read them and other people will experience them for the first time, maybe. But the process of writing it is a process, I think, at least for that time, of exhausting that material. And so it's a risky thing to write it. And there have been essays that I think that I have written too quickly. And I don't think the story actually means what I thought it meant.
Right. Yeah.
So I've learned as my career has gone on to be, none of us have complete knowledge. It's always perspectival, our take on the thing. But to be a bit more tentative, a bit more hesitant in making the huge proclamation, this is what this means.
Yeah. No, I think it's the dilemma of writing, especially a memoir, is what you just said. You are trying to register it, right? You're trying to make a record of this thing so it doesn't get lost. But in doing that, you are losing something. And it's necessary. I think it's worth the risk. I think it's worth doing. But I don't know if you're familiar with Mary Carr's idea of semantic memory versus episodic memory. And the idea being once you put a memory into words, and then at the same time interpret, because you are interpreting as you put it into words, you have somehow locked it in a way for good or for ill. You've locked it in.
Yeah.
And so it's not lost, but it's also locked in.
That's right. And we know, right? We know from experience that, what we make of our memories, the way that we tell those stories or don't tell other stories, we strive for objectivity. We want to be as factually accurate as possible. And there are ways to check that here and there. But, our subconscious has all these reasons why it's shaping that story in that particular way. I mean, I've had the experience of writing something and publishing it, and then I look down and it's a phone call from my father, or from my mother. Just want to let you know that didn't happen that way.
Yeah, right.
Here's some more information, and that's always. It's not a scary reality. It's just that's always illuminating. It's like, we're selective, no question about it. And yet I'm addicted. Like I love memoir. I really do. I think that our memories are just treasured. They're just a treasure chest. The way that time, things end, relationships end, you move, you're not in that place anymore, time passes. And yet in memory, you can revisit it. This seems miraculous to me. This seems like just a treasure trove of material and contemplation. And I'm I'm addicted to that. I'm addicted to memory. But anytime you're writing about memory, the line that you're walking is you want to use your memories to have them open up into something larger, and you want to resist nostalgia.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah.
Tell me about the idea of, what was the phrase you used before resisting nostalgia? You said you want them to open up into something larger. You want your memories to open up into something larger.
Yeah. Well, so
what you mean by that?
One way to talk about memoir, I think one reason why a lot of people maybe dismiss it, or why a lot of writers are highly resistant to it, and I think rightfully so, is because, they have a humility about them. Like, why would anybody care about my life? Like, compared to people I know, like, this seems selfish.
Yeah.
This seems like navel gazing. And there are those kind of memoirs. There are those kinds of personal essays,
Sure.
No question about it. But what I have found is that, ironically, the essays, the memoirs that in a very idiosyncratic, detailed way document a life or an episode of life, that's actually a portal to a kind of universality.
Mm-hmm.
That it's by actually attending to your unique and individual experience that all of these connections are made with other people who haven't lived that experience.
Yeah.
And so I think the best memoir does that. It's not an exercise in, staring at ourselves in the mirror. It's actually a way of saying, here's my human experience, pay attention to me paying attention, and then write your own, that it can actually be a selfless kind of act. And this is, and I would say, just to add to that, over time, I've become more resistant to just sort of the straight memoir that's only about me, my life, my family, and those kind of personal essays. And what I want to do increasingly is to mix arts criticism, in particular, writing about the visual arts or writing about music, with the personal essay. And to me, this is an exciting combination, because you can expand your conception of yourself by refracting your own experience through a cultural artifact that has resonance beyond you. And so it ends up being not just an essay about you, but it becomes an essay about your experience in the world with cultural realities, and that then expands sort of the horizons of what the essay can do. And it's something that's relatable, because everybody has experiences with the music they love, with the art that they love.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it as I was reading your book, and which sort of goes pretty seamlessly between memoir and mostly the cultural criticism is mostly country music. I hadn't thought about this till you said that, but you and I have both experienced, Vern Gosdin's song "Chiseled in Stone," which I was so excited to see that you wrote about that, because I didn't know anybody else loved that song. I know people loved it very much in 1989, but it feels a little bit forgotten. I heard it in Tractor Supply the other day and thought, oh wow, this is just bringing me back to But that really was a point of common experience, where that I, on the one hand, you are being pretty specific about your experience, but then you're tying that to an experience that I've also had, which is listening to that song, or to George Jones or Johnny Cash.
Yeah, and hopefully, even though I'm writing, I grew up in Nashville under the influence of stories and songs, and it very much was country music before it was anything else, even though country music led me in all kinds of directions musically. But hopefully people can read this book, and even though it might be about a genre of music or songs that they've never heard, or maybe even have certain assumptions about, hopefully by the way that I write about that they can still access that as an experience that's common to them. And I would just say, there's this, I'm trying to thinking about what you said earlier, just the conversation about storytelling, and now thinking about country music. I'm realizing, even just talking to you now, that even though I've been to college, I've been to grad school, even though I've now published a book, it was drilled into me from a really early age that writing should attempt to draw attention to those sort of backwoods places, those overlooked places, those people, that art that maybe doesn't have as much cachet.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great line from a poem by Patrick Kavanagh, Irish poet, sort of between Yeats and Seamus Heaney. And he said, the line says, "A humble scene in a backwards place where no one important ever looked."
Mm.
I remember reading that and just thinking, I want to own that. Like, that's the kind of thing that I want to be about in my work. And so I love in this book that I've had the occasion to draw attention to coal miners and to, people without much education, to mechanics, to, my great grandmother who, ran that trailer in coal country for all those years, wiping down my great grandfather after he got home from the mines, but also to write about country music in a way that maybe other people are writing about classical music, or in a way that other people are writing about, art forms that seem to be more resonant. And part of me, like, there are so many good writers on country music, and this book is an homage to them, no question about it. But it's also the case that whenever you write, you're sort of filling in a gap that you see, And what I've wanted to do is to say that I think that we could do close readings of some of these songs. I think that we should talk about the lyricism, like as lyricism, like the way we would talk about Keats's poetry or something. Because I am, even though I have mixed feelings about country music. There's good, there's bad, there's ugly. People, we say that you're from Tennessee, people will always ask you, do you like country music? And that's the wrong question, right? It's like, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It's what you have. Like, it's all around you. Even if you don't seek it out, it's coming for you, But anyway, getting a little distance from it, having this store of songs in my memory, you start to think about the wordplay. There's a genius at play, even in the rotation of songs on country radio, the kind of variations on a theme that you see play out over time. Not to mention the sort of next level artists like a Johnny Cash.
I want to. I'd like to return to that porch where the stories are being told. Because I'm especially interested in a moment that you describe where you're listening to the stories, you're engaged in these stories as a child, and then there's an episode involving a coyote, okay, where your uncle gets up and shoots at a coyote that has scared your little cousins, and you as a child, you say you were frustrated that the story was interrupted. And yet at the same time, ironically, that became, you said that was the first story you remember telling, was the story of the time your uncle got up and shot the coyote. And so I'm going to read this back to you again. To me, the stories on the porch were central. To them, the storytellers, the stories were secondary to the life they described. They were always interruptible. They were the opposite of precious. They were discardable because they were liable, even likely, to be replaced by another. That's really interesting. And I'd love to hear you expand on that idea a little bit more if you can, if you're willing to, because on the one hand, you're talking about people being open to experience that becomes the raw material for story. You said again, you said of your grandfather, it was as if the world presented itself principally as material for stories. And yet those stories, I don't even know what I'm having a hard time putting into words. The idea that you have to continue to be open to stories instead of being so attached to these stories you've already put together. I don't know. The floor is now open.
It's almost like storytelling is a way of life rather than as an event. It was impossible to get my grandfather to tell you a story on demand. He just wouldn't do it. It had to arise extemporaneously in the course of whatever was happening. And that's why, these I would think of them more like a jam session, like it was an event for me, but for them, it was just another Friday night with friends and family. And it could be the case that they had some stories in mind, some jokes, to share when they came over. But I
sometimes line up my anecdotes when I'm driving to it.
Yeah. What do they hear?
I don't usually get to, to get all of my anecdotes off, but I have them lined up sometimes.
Yeah. But I always had the feel, I know exactly what you mean. If you've ever been to, there's a great bluegrass club in downtown Nashville called the Station Inn.
Sure.
It used to be sort of remote and not central, and now it's in the middle of the Gulch, and it's kind of strange to see that juxtaposition because it's still a pretty old timey bluegrass club.
Yeah,
but well regarded, definitely a place that people want to play. But if you ever go down there on a Sunday night, they have a jam session, and anybody who has an instrument and has a mind to do it can just join the circle and start playing. And it's a real mixed bag. Like there will be famous musicians occasionally picking, there will be others that are not famous, but are studio, session players that are there. There are others that are just mainstay like this. They do this every week. And there are others that are just learning how to play the banjo, the fiddle, and it can be pretty rough. But the cool thing about a jam session like that, and there are comparable things in like hip hop ciphers and other forms of music have this, but is that there is a sense that they are just making it up as they go.
Yeah.
It's like this song, you see the light bulb appear over the head of somebody as that song ends, that would lead very nicely into this next song, song. And in this storytelling sessions, I often had the sense that something comparable was going, almost like there was a spirit moving, among them. It didn't, at some point, the sort of like preparation and if there was something planned about it fell away, and it was riffing in real time based upon what came before. And also a little bit competitive. Like I remember sometimes these people are legendary. I'd give anything to just be able to be back there on a night. Jim Ford, Dr. DeLeon, these people that for me were names in my grandfather's story before I ever saw them. But there they were. And, they would be competing for who's going to say it next. And sometimes you see the whole human thing go on, a little bit of disappointment. Do I interject and speak over the next person? But then it kind of like get up, light the cigarette, whatever. And then resign yourself to the fact that you're not telling yours, sit back down, be entertained,
Yeah, right.
There's just something about the human drama of that. It felt like it felt, even though it was not artistic in a classic sense,
right?
To me, it felt like sort of pure creation, happening in real time. And the way, the extemporaneity of it is sort of like these people, not only did they tell stories, but they were characters in stories.
Yeah, right.
There's a tremendous amount of just self-confidence. Like that's the wrong word. It's just being who you are, trusting the material. And as a writer, I think that we long for that kind of freedom, that kind of liberation, because we're always critiquing kind of every sentence that we put down.
Yeah.
Trying to perfect it, wondering how that might land. How could we do it better?
Yeah.
And yet I think that the end result of, I'm not saying that written stories are not important. I think that they really are. But what I'm saying is that they're a kind of last draft.
I'm trying to think as you're talking about storytelling as jam session and in the truth that this is how we communicate with each other, not all the time, but often. And there's something jazzy about, as you say, there's almost like this collective stream of consciousness. You tell a story and I think, oh yeah, that makes me think of something else. And what can a writer learn from that? Because as you said, writing is artificial. It's an artificial act. Right?
Yeah.
If you have a baby and the baby hangs out with storytellers, the baby will eventually start telling stories. But the baby's not going to start writing unless you sit down and teach the baby how to write. You don't just pick it up the way you pick up speech.
Yeah, writing is made, it's worked,
Yeah.
it's revised. And in that sense, it is artificial. It's not the authentic utterance.
Yeah, I know. There's no reason to, I mean, I'm using artificial in the most neutral possible term. It's art.
No question about it. And yet, you know it when you see it. There are people that have the ability to tell a story. So there's the material, but then there's what you make of it. And even though it's not as intense or as worked as an essay is or as a novel is, a good storyteller is shaping that story.
Right.
There's the introduction of the character's situation, right? There's action. There's a kind of resolution, even if there's not a lot of interpretation. And so I think that I do think that a lot of the short stories and novels that I love most do seem to me on the page to be channeling a kind of storytelling.
Sure.
And that is not true of everybody. I have had a lot of friends in grad school who would resist this idea of storytelling. To them, that's just archaic. It's sort of irresponsible. Where's the art in that? Do we really want to go back to a campfire and just, accumulate wisdom by listening to a wise person, spin tales that might be fables that have a lesson to them, this sort of thing. And yet, so I'm thinking about a novel like, I really love this Tennessee writer. Hardly anybody reads him anymore. But in his prime, he was the real deal, and he won a Pulitzer Prize, and he was published. His stories were published in the New Yorker every other week in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Talking about Peter Taylor. He's from Memphis, so different kind of Tennessee experience than mine. And he came from a very wealthy, kind of privileged background. He's got this story called In the Tennessee Country, and the whole story is this man coming back home for the funeral of a loved one, kind of a legendary figure in his life. And he just tells the story of this man's life sort of while he's on the train headed back. And, it is more worked. The voice is more refined, controlled than any story that you would ever hear uttered on a back porch, on a hillside of Tennessee. But nevertheless, you can tell Peter Taylor values that kind of primal form of storytelling. Yeah. And so like the Bub essay that gives the book its title, one of the things that I was really laboring over in that piece was to try to figure out how do I avoid nostalgia? How do I avoid all the kind of trappings of writing about people that you love dearly, right? The kind of sentimentality, but still, needing to go for the heart nonetheless. But how do I tell stories about my granddad in a way that feels like organic, cumulative, that's not just rambling, that in the end is sort of shaping a picture, presenting a portrait of him. And so the way that I eventually landed on, and this came from reading a writer named John Berger, who I love, who writes a lot of highly lyrical, always kind of personal arts criticism. He died a few years ago. I recommend his work. But the way that I eventually landed on was, what if I didn't write sort of like directly into my grandfather's life? What if I didn't just tell the story chronologically? But what if I sort of cataloged these, different aspects of his even physical appearance and his possessions, the things that he valued, and sort of just riffed on those, And what I found was that was a way for me to get a lot of those stories into the text, and even to put them in his mouth occasionally.
Yeah. Okay. You learned a lot about storytelling from storytellers who weren't especially educated. And then you went eventually to one of the most storied creative writing programs in the world, University of Iowa. So Iowa University. How do you say it? Iowa University.
University of Iowa. Yep.
University of Iowa. Yeah. What's the question? What did you learn, unlearn? Like going from, you have all this raw material, sort of, if not instinctive modes of storytelling, at least ingrained modes of storytelling, that you then arrive at an MFA program, I assume, with. What happens to that raw material? I've never been to an MFA program. What happens with all that big pile of not just material, but also methods, right?
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm sure for your listeners, some might be considering MFA programs or wondering, like, what is that about? Is that even something that I should do? I never thought I would do that. I came to a point, and I should say I was working as a journalist for many years, and I came to a point in my career where it's like, okay, I sort of feel plateaued as a writer. I know how to do these things. I know how to write a profile. I know how to write some, different forms of journalistic pieces. I had written a few personal essays and published them here and there. I came to a point where I'm like, if I'm going to do this, like if I'm going to go for broke as a writer, I need to blow up my conceptions of what I think is possible. I need to be exposed to some new stuff. I would like to be around people who actually value this and that I don't have to sort of explain myself in front of. So I applied, and I did not think I would get in. And, lo and behold, I did. And I got to tell you, nobody has ever gotten more out of an MFA program than I did.
Really?
I was like a kid in a candy store.
Huh.
I was a little bit older. I didn't go right out of undergrad. I went 7 years after I graduated undergrad. And the whole thing felt like such a privilege to get to take classes with writers I really admired and respected, like Marilyn Robinson.
I was going to ask you, but
like John DeGatta, like Vivian Gornick, a wide range of writers, to get to be around other aspiring writers who are still working on their first books, and to just be edified by their insightful feedback on my own work. And then I also got the opportunity to teach while I was there. And I really loved that. I really enjoyed putting together the syllabus filled with stuff that I wanted to read. It was interesting to hear what these students would make of it. So it was a wonderful experience for me. It was also very challenging. You come into an MFA program, if you're a writer and you think, I'm pretty good at this, like I'm not the best, I've got a lot to learn, and then you get there and you're like, oh, everybody in this room was the best writer that anybody had ever met. Right. So it was very humbling. Okay, you asked about the material and what an MFA program sort of does with that. So the first thing that it does is it messes you up because all of a sudden you have all of these voices in your head of people that are smarter than you. I always felt like the dumbest guy in every room, the least read guy in every single room. Yeah. All these voices in your head saying, do this, don't do that. Consider this, consider that. Meanwhile, in seminars, I took a great class with Marilyn Robinson about Moby Dick, a whole semester just on Moby Dick. So meanwhile, in seminars, you're being exposed to all this, just unclassifiable genius of forebears who did, things that would still seem progressive and innovative. And how in the world did they get away with that now? But they published them 150 years ago. How in the world are you supposed to, in an environment like that, sort of get quiet enough and confident enough to actually, work with your own material again in a voice that you identify as your own, So I would say that the first couple of years there, my writing really was terrible because I was, trying to do what I knew how to do, but trying to take into consideration all these other things that I thought were cool. That I was enamored of, but I was just being derivative, and it wasn't until like the third year, kind of in a moment of crisis, because by the third year, like you need to be producing a lot of pages for your sort of final project. So in my third year, my advisor said, what you've written is not going to work as your final project. And I said, what do you mean? I've got like 6 months before I'm done. He said, I think you need to start from scratch.
Wow.
And I was like, you have got to be kidding me, And he said, why don't you just take the weekend and just write one short essay about something that you know something about already. And I wrote an essay about country music. I wrote an essay about Garth Brooks. That was the essay that I wrote that weekend. And I brought it back to him on Monday. And he said, all right, just do this a bunch of times. And so that semester, it was like, I have got limited amount of time. I need to produce this many pages. And what he just gave me permission to do was something I didn't think I could do. And that is just, bring to bear all the things that you've learned, but trust your material, write what only you can write in the way that you can write it. And that was actually such a liberating semester, because I didn't have time to really think much. It was just go. Go.
Was that the Garth Brooks essay that ends up in this book?
An earlier iteration of it. But that was the first one that sort of did it. And it was wonderful, because at some point it's like, what are you going to write about? Well, as a journalist, my writing had been related to reporting.
Right.
And so I was spending 2-3 weeks, here or there, whatever, trying to tell this story. But when you're in grad school and you have a family and you have other obligations like teaching, you can't, you actually don't have the freedom to go do all that reporting. It's like, what are you going to write? And I found, to my surprise, I always knew that I knew a lot of country songs, but what I realized was I had a lot of thoughts about that. It was highly tied into my own sort of struggle's the wrong word, but my own sort of reconceiving of what it means to be from the South, and what does this music mean? How useful is this music as like an interpretive tool to help me make sense of being a father, being a husband, going through trials in life. And I actually found that it was pretty useful.
You had you not written about country music until you were at Iowa trying to get your
No, not in any intentional way. I had published one very brief first person essay about the experience of just growing up around a lot of songs. Years before, but that was it. It didn't seem to me like it was a valid kind of project, And then come to find out, there's this whole wealth of literature that I didn't know about. And, you like with anything, you think you've arrived at something novel, right? Only to turn around and realize, oh my gosh, there's like,
I've got a whole shelf over here of all books about country music. From it's sort of I call it my Nashville shelf.
There's some great ones.
There really are. And some terrible ones.
And there's others that are like the criticism, like the arguments that are being made are wonderful, but the writing's not very good. And then there are others where the writing is just funny, folksy, but also kind of literary. But the analysis is kind of lacking, And so I think that's the sort of thing that I wanted to try the best of those two to try to compare.
All right, we're coming up on our time limit here, so I want to ask you. I'm looking forward to your answer to this question that I almost always ask, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
That is a great question, and it's changed over time for me. I would say the first writers that made me want to write, it must have been Faulkner for me. And not that I understood Faulkner. I'm talking about when I was in high school. Not that I understood him. There was mystery there. I didn't really understand the history of the South or where he was coming from.
Right.
But again, I understood when I cracked open Absalom, for all that I didn't understand, that this is people telling stories. Like this is different people telling the same stories from different perspectives, and they're not to be trusted, and they are to be trusted, and So I think, and the other thing about Faulkner was, it was like in school, you were always being assigned to read books about other places and other times. And I'm not from Mississippi, I'm from Tennessee, but with Faulkner, it was like, oh, I recognize some of this landscape. I recognize even some of the phrases that people are speaking in. So that was cool. And then I would say, along with Faulkner, I'm going to say a photographer who did something comparable for me. And that is the photographer, William Christenberry. So there's the Faulkner thing. And then when I moved up to DC, one of my very first days in the city as a journalist, I went into the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, and there on the walls were all these pictures of barns, churches, gourd trees, church signs, little market stalls on the sides of highways. And this was baffling to me, because my conception of art had always been, prints of impressionist paintings from Europe, this sort of thing. But here on the walls of this museum was like pictures of things that I knew. Like I knew I'd been in those places, and somebody thought they were beautiful because there they are. And so I think Faulkner, and then a photographer like Christenberry, it was just like, permission. You don't need to be from somewhere else. You should actually, as a human being, not as a nativist or anything like that, saying that your region is more important than other regions. But that's what you know. That's where you've grown up. That's your material. Do something with that. I would say too, writers who, and I was exposed to this in grad school, just these writers who are fusing together sort of different genres. Sometimes this works better than at other times, and I'm not opposed to genre at all, but I've really appreciated and been inspired by writers who blend memoir and arts criticism. Writers like John Berger, like I mentioned, Teju Cole, who does something in a similar vein with his writing about photography, Vivian Gornick, who I mentioned earlier. And then lastly, I would say poets. It must be the case that all of us just wish that we could be poets. I remember telling my parents that in high school, and they're like, "You're not going to be a poet. It's journalism. You can make money as a journalist." But when I found myself in journalism school for undergrad, I was just trying to be around the poets. I was trying to spend as much time reading poetry as I could. And the thing that I wanted that it had, and that, aspirationally that I wanted, was just the naming things precisely. How a few words ordered in a certain way with a kind of music, paying attention to the music of how they play against each other, can just light up something so that you what they have just written, you acknowledge as being true. And there was the elements of that in Faulkner. I remember in Absalom, even from that first reading, this phrase, it's not central to the novel, but I'll never forget it. The soft and fuller random of fireflies. The soft and fuller random of fireflies. You tell me, look out across a meadow on a summer night and tell me if that is not the best description of what's going on with those lightning bulbs as anything.
Absalom was my entry point into Faulkner too. Actually, The Bear was my very first
great story
entry, and then Absalom was the first novel I read, and I didn't know what to make of it, but I loved it and didn't know what I was reading.
Yes.
Well, Drew Bratcher, thank you so much for being here. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope a lot of people read Bub and benefit from it, because I know I did.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.